Year 7, welcome to your third history lesson, your YouTube lessons made by me, Miss Thika. We are carrying on with some of the content we were looking at last lesson, thinking about the problems that Henry VIII had with the Roman Catholic Church, some of the main problems he faced as a king, and we're carrying on today thinking about the King's Great Matter. Was known as Henry VIII's Great Matter, and that's what he called it, and how he went about to solve his Great Matter. So just the same as usual, you need something to write on, so get a bit of paper or an exercise book if you have it, and get today's date and title in. So the title is, what was Henry VIII's Great Matter and how did he solve this problem? So to start off with, as a little starter, we are going to do a quick odd one out quiz. So I've written 3 quiz questions here, and I have given you 3 answers. I want you to pick the odd one out. So one of these, either A, B or C, does not fit, and that is the odd one out. So you don't need to write the question out, you don't even need to write the full answer out, you just need to write the letter. So hopefully that makes sense. So pause me whilst you get your date and title in, and then in a second I'll start with the odd one out quiz. Right, so question 1. Key people in the Peasants' Revolt. Which one is the odd one out? So out of these 3 people, one of them was not a key person in the Peasants' Revolt. So is it A, Wat Tyler, B, Henry VII, or C, John Ball? So write down the letter of the person that does not fit, which is the odd one out. 2, give me an impact of the Black Death. So one of these was not an impact of the Black Death. Give me the odd one out. A, they created a vaccine for it. B, entire villages were wiped out. And C, wages were driven up. So A, B or C, which one is the odd one out? Which one was not an impact of the Black Death? And finally, a reason why William of Normandy won the Battle of Hastings. Again, one of these is not a reason, so which is the odd one out? A reason why he won was he had trained men, he had trained his men to be skillful fighters. B, he had already killed Harold Hardrada before the battle. Or C, he tricked the English to come down the hill. So which one of those is not right? Which is the odd one out? Okay, answers. So number 1, key people in the Peasants' Revolt. You should have put B as your odd one out. We know that A, Wat Tyler, he was the man that really rallied the peasants and became the figurehead for the Peasants' Revolt, and he led the peasants to London to confront the king and his advisors. And it also can't be C, John Ball, because we know that he also played a pretty big part in the Peasants' Revolt. He teamed up with Wat Tyler. John Ball was the priest who said that everyone was born equal and that evil lords were taking advantage of poor peasants. However, Henry VII is the odd one out, and hopefully you can tell me why, but if you can't, that's wrong, because it wasn't Henry VII who was king during the Peasants' Revolt. It was the boy king, Richard II, who ruled with his uncle John of Gaunt to help him. So you should have put B as your odd one out. Number 2, impact of the Black Death. Which one is the odd one out? Hopefully you put A, they created a vaccine. We know that they didn't create a vaccine with the Black Death, that eventually the Black Death just kind of dwindled out and left. It didn't leave completely. We do see the plague popping back up again throughout the course of history, but not on the scale that it was during the Black Death. So you should have got A. It can't be B and C because we know that B is correct. Entire villages were completely wiped out during the Black Death. And C, wages were driven up. And this kind of links with the Peasants' Revolt as well, even though the Peasants' Revolt came decades after the Black Death. We know that because so many peasants died due to the Black Death, the lords had fewer people to work on their land. So as a result, they had to pay the peasants more and give them slightly more freedom and rights shortly after the Black Death, which, as the population started to increase again, the lords brought wages back down, which is one of the reasons why the Peasants' Revolt took place in 1381. And then number 3, this is going back quite a while. This is before Christmas, so hopefully you're able to remember this. A reason why William of Normandy won the Battle of Hastings. We know it can't be A, because that is true. William trained his men to be exceptionally skillful. He had knights on horseback and really skillful archers that Harold Godwinson just didn't have. And C, we know it can't be that one as well, because he did trick the English to come down the hill. The English had the upper hand by being at the top of Senlac Hill. William knew that he was not going to be able to win the battle whilst the English were at the top. He had to break their shield formation and he had to get those English off that hill. So if you remember from the lessons that we did, he pretended to be dead and he told his men to pretend to surrender. And when his men surrendered, the English foolishly ran down the hill to charge after them. And that is when the Normans jumped around and slayed the English. So the odd one out is B. He had already killed Harold Hardrada. Well, hopefully you know that that can't be true, because William of Normandy did not kill Harold Hardrada. It was Harold Godwinson that killed Harold Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge before the Battle of Hastings took place. So hopefully you've managed to remember some of those, and you might maybe have got all 3 of them right. So as I've said, today we are focusing on Henry VIII. We looked at him last lesson and we looked at some of the problems he faced whilst he was king, and we are adding to that today. We are thinking about the king's great matter and what he did to solve this problem. So the first thing you're going to do is, normally I would get you to stick this into your exercise books, but obviously we can't do that, so we'll just talk it through instead. You're going to stick in a contemporary source from Henry VIII. Well, what does that mean? Contemporary means that it is from that time period. So this is actually a letter that Henry wrote himself to his closest advisor of the time, someone called Cardinal Thomas Wolsey. Wolsey was really high up in the Roman Catholic Church, but he lived in England and he was one of Henry's closest friends. He'd been almost like a father to Henry for several years, and he helped Henry run his monasteries and churches within England. So this is another word for a contemporary source is a primary source. It means that it comes from that time period. So this is a letter from Henry to Cardinal Wolsey. What I want you to do is I'm going to read it to you because, as you'll see in a second, it is written in Old English, so it's a little bit tricky to read. I would like you to bullet point, what can you infer from this source about the problems that Henry faced? So if you remember, we've done these types of questions before. Infer means learn. Basically, what can you learn from this letter about the problems that Henry had? And from this letter, what do you think was Henry's great matter? Because that is what it was called at the time, the King's Great Matter. So you can see here from this, it almost looks like a browny kind of tea-stained letter, that this was the original letter that Henry wrote. Obviously, I'm not going to expect you to be able to read that because it's exceptionally difficult. It's written in Old English, you wouldn't be able to read it, basically. So I've typed it out, and this is what I'm going to read to you here, but as you should probably be able to see, there are quite a few red squiggly lines under some of these words. That's because I've typed it out in a way that Henry would have written it during this time. They didn't have set spellings as much during that time period. So often you would find, whoops, sorry, my email's just bleeping. You would often find that different people would spell words in different ways, and there wasn't set spellings. So sometimes in one letter they might spell the same word two different ways. Names as well. So Henry's first wife was called Catherine of Aragon, and people throughout her life spell her name completely differently. So sometimes it's with a K, sometimes it's with a C. It just varies. So this is the letter that you're going to be answering 2 questions about. So Henry was disappointed with the sex of his new child, Princess Mary, because she was a girl. Princess Mary was born on the 18th of February 1516. Henry wrote that he and Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, were both young, so even though she'd given birth to Princess Mary, he is writing that he's hopeful that they're going to have sons later on. So in this letter, which is Henry writing to Thomas Wolsey in 1518, Henry writes the following: "I trust the Queen, my wife, be with child." That is basically what they called being pregnant back then. They would say she is with child. Henry explains that this was partly due to Catherine's dangerous times. He was reluctant to allow her to travel to London from Woodstock, where they were staying. And Henry explains, he says, "My lord, I know it is not an assured thing, but as anything, I have great hope." In November 1518, Henry's hopes for a male heir to ensure the Tudor succession were crushed again when Catherine gave birth to another stillborn baby girl. If a baby's stillborn, that means that they've sadly died when they've been born, so they're still, they've dead, they've not survived. So what I would like you to do is, using this letter here that Henry wrote to Thomas Wolsey, his closest friend, I would like you to try to answer these 2 questions. What do you think the king's great matter was? In that letter, what do you think was Henry's biggest problem? What's his greatest concern? And what do you think Henry could do to solve this problem? So pause me for 2 minutes now whilst you try to answer those 2 questions. And if you need to, rewind me a little bit and go back and have that contemporary source in front of you, so you can use that as a little bit of evidence if you want to. So pause me now and answer these 2 questions. Okay, so the King's Great Matter. Hopefully you have written down something along the lines of an heir. We've talked about this word before. An heir basically means it's not spelled the same as air that we breathe, it's spelled with an H. An heir is the next in line to the throne. Henry's great matter was that he had no male heir. He had a child, he had the Princess Mary, but during this time period, attitudes towards women were really poor, and there hadn't been a queen before. There had been a queen in the sense of the king would marry, and therefore his wife would become the queen, but that's different. There hadn't been a queen that had actually ruled and inherited the throne from her father. A lot of people back then believed that women couldn't and women shouldn't rule alone, that they weren't capable of doing it, that only a man could do it. So Henry's great matter was that he had no sons, and every time Catherine fell pregnant, she either miscarried or gave birth to a stillborn baby or gave birth to a girl, and in Henry's eyes that wasn't good enough. So what could Henry do to solve this problem? Obviously we can't have, normally I would have a chat with the class about this to see what people would think, but obviously we can't really do that. But some of the common ideas that people press forward is, they say Henry could have a divorce. Well, technically he can't have a divorce because Henry's Roman Catholic and they don't believe in divorce. They believe in death till you, no, what is it they say again? Until death do you part, which means basically you're stuck with your wife or your husband until one of you dies. So he can't really do that. Another common suggestion is, well, why doesn't Henry just get a girlfriend and have a baby with her? Well, again, Henry actually had a lot of girlfriends. That was really common during this time period, that even though men were married, it wasn't seen as being such a bad thing to have a girlfriend, or a mistress as they called them back then. Henry had mistresses up and down the country. He very much enjoyed having more than one girl on the go at the time. He was a bit of a womanizer. And in fact, Henry did actually have a son called Henry Fitzroy, to one of his girlfriends called Bessie Blount. However, there's a problem with that, because Bessie isn't queen. Bessie is just one of Henry's mistresses, which means that Henry Fitzroy, who was the legitimate child of Henry, he was a boy. There was no doubt in that he was Henry VIII's son. He cannot inherit the throne, because his mum is not the queen. That's how this works. You can only inherit the throne if you are a legitimate claimant, and that means that your mum and dad are king and queen. So Henry can have as many extramarital affairs as he likes, but them children, unfortunately, they are known as bastards, which means that their parents are not married and they can't inherit the throne. So what else can he do? In the past, some people have been a bit blunt and they've said, well, why doesn't he just kill his wife? Even though Henry can do a lot of things during this time period, killing his wife isn't really one of them, so that isn't something that Henry would be able to do. So, well, what does he do? That's what we're going to be thinking about today. Henry has got a number of issues that he has to deal with, and there is no clear solution as to how he is going to solve these problems. So if we have a quick recap, this is some of the problems that we talked about last lesson, to just jog your memory. He needs a son. He's been married for 24 years at this point to his wife, Catherine of Aragon. She is much older than him, if you remember we chatted about that last lesson. Women get to a stage where they can't keep having children. So even though men can father a child their entire life, it's not the same for women. Eventually they get to a point in life where they can no longer have any more children. So Henry is worried about his inheritance and who is going to take the throne when he dies. Henry as well, by the time we get into the 30s, the 1530s, Henry has got a different type of girlfriend. Henry has fallen in love with a woman called Anne Boleyn. He wants to make Anne his mistress, but Anne is very intelligent, and Anne knows that if she falls pregnant and gives birth to Henry's child, that will just be another child in the pile, really, and that their child won't be able to inherit the throne. She suggests that they get married. That means that Henry's going to have to divorce Catherine. The Pope has said no, so he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. He's getting quite a bit of pressure by Anne. Anne was a very intelligent woman for her time, and she wanted to become queen. So she played quite a decent game, really, in terms of encouraging Henry to get rid of his first wife. Henry's also got cash problems. He looks at the Roman Catholic Church, he sees they're very rich, he wants that money for himself, but he doesn't know how to get his hands on it. He knows that he's got to pay heavy taxes to Rome and to the Pope, and he starts to think, hang on a minute, maybe it would be better if instead of sending this money to Rome and the Pope, what if we could keep this money in England instead? And finally, there are cries and complaints around Europe that the Roman Catholic Church is actually being a little bit cheeky. If you think back to our first lesson where we looked at some of the common abuses of the Roman Catholic Church, people were starting to get pretty fed up with them. Some people in England argued that the Bible should be written in English and not Latin. the vast majority of people in England and actually across Europe could not read Latin. So to many people, they were worshipping a Bible that actually they didn't understand what it said. The only way you could understand what it said was by going to church and having your priest read it to you. Although there is a lot of evidence to suggest that some of these cheeky priests couldn't actually read Latin themselves and they were just making it up as they went along. People thought, well, if I want to be a good Christian, surely I should be able to read the Bible myself and speak to God by reading the Bible and praying. Henry had heard about a guy I'm going to talk to you about in a second, about a guy who had suggested that Latin shouldn't be the language that was used. Henry thought, maybe this is actually quite a good idea. Maybe I should make some changes to the church as well, and that might help me in a couple of other situations. So what does Henry decide to do? In 1534, Henry does something drastic. He broke with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I don't mean literally broke it. He doesn't snap it. When I say broke, I mean he leaves the Roman Catholic Church. He splits from it. And he makes himself head of a new church called the Church of England. If you went to a primary school, which was a C of E primary school, then this is effectively the reason why you're a Church of England primary school. And that's because Henry set up the Church of England. This was known as the English Reformation. So Reformation isn't a word that we tend to use very often. It might not be a word that you've heard before, but Reformation basically just means change. He has changed the religion in the country from being Roman Catholic to Church of England. They are still Christian, still worshipping God and Jesus and reading the Bible. That hasn't changed, but now the Pope is no longer the head of the church. It's the king that's the head of the church. That effectively makes Henry the boss. Why does Henry decide to do this? Well, this isn't a random act. Henry just didn't suddenly, dream up this idea. This is actually started by a guy in Europe known as Martin Luther. Not Martin Luther King, a different Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a German priest who, in the early 1500s, had kind of had one of those light bulb moments where he thought, actually, I'm a pretty good priest and I'm a nice guy, but I look around and I see that the Roman Catholic Church actually isn't a very nice organisation, and I don't agree with a lot of the things that they are doing, particularly some of the abuses that we talked about a couple of lessons ago, like selling indulgences. If you've forgotten what an indulgence was, an indulgence was basically a certificate that you could buy which had written on it, you are forgiven of your sins, and poor peasants would give all of their money to their local church to buy this bit of paper because they honestly believed that it would send them to heaven when they died. This made the church really rich and it made peasants really poor. And it was fraud, really. It's wrong to take that money from people. So when Martin Luther saw this going on in Germany, in an area called Wittenberg, he got so cross that he wrote out something called his 95 Theses, which is basically 95 things I hate about the Roman Catholic Church. And you can see in this picture here, he famously hammered his 95 Theses on the door to the local church, and he invited people to come and read it. And it's very rare in history that you can say that one person single-handedly caused so much change, but Martin Luther really does cause an awful lot of change in 1517 by doing what he did. So the Reformation starts in Germany. People slowly start to break away from the power of the Roman Catholic Church. These people are Christians, but they call themselves a different type of Christian. Now we've got Protestants who still worship God and Jesus. They still use the Bible, they still go to church, but they don't believe in the power and the greed and the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. So Henry uses Martin Luther's early Reformation across Europe to his own advantage, and he starts the English Reformation, where England officially breaks from the church, and he makes himself his own Church of England, where he is the head of it. So this seems like a whole lot of fuss. So why did Henry do it? What we're going to do is, normally I would give you cards to cut and stick, but obviously we can't do that. So we're going to do it in a slightly different way. We've done diamond nines before, if you were in my class, and I know some of you whinged about them the last time we did them because you couldn't get your head around what a diamond nine was. So remember, a diamond nine is basically a ranking exercise. You are going to be given 9 different reasons why Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church, and you are going to rank them in order. The top of your diamond is going to be the most important reason. This is completely down to you. Then the next 2 that are going to form your diamond are going to be the second and third most important. Then you would have your 3 in the middle, which would be your 4th, 5th and 6th, going all the way down to 7, 8 and 9, and then you would have 1 at the very bottom that you would argue would be the least important reason. So you are placing them in order of importance. I think the easiest way to do this is, if you are using an exercise book, use a full page, or if you've got paper, use a full page, and try to write the information out in little chunks. Maybe draw a little bubble or a box around it, so that in the end you've got a full page of information that is shaped like a diamond. So you can see at the top, this would be your most important reason, and then all the way to the bottom, your least important reason. I hope that makes sense. So here are your reasons. These are your 9 reasons. You don't have to write them out in full, because as I've said, normally I would print this out and you would cut it and stick it. So there's quite a bit of detail here. But if you want to, feel free to write them all out. So I'm going to read these to you, and then you are going to use this information and write it out in this diamond shape. Okay? So what was the main reason why Henry VIII broke with the Roman Catholic Church? Number 1, do you think this is the most important reason? Henry's girlfriend, Anne Boleyn, had fallen pregnant in 1533. If she gave birth before they were married, their child would be a bastard and would not be able to inherit the throne. Remember, girls only and women only stay pregnant for 9 months before the baby comes. So by the time we get into 1533, the clock is literally ticking for Henry. He has to marry Anne before the baby comes. Or 2, what about this one? Many of Henry's advisors argued that the Pope had become too rich and too powerful. Do you think that one is more important than the previous one? Number 3, Pope Clement VII refused to grant Henry a divorce, even though they had once been great friends. Henry was even awarded the Defender of the Faith for being such a good Catholic. Do you think that is more important than the others? Or number 4, some people in Europe had started to set up their own churches away from the Roman Catholic Church. As they were becoming fed up of the abuses and the corruption, these people were known as Protestants. So do you think these Protestant groups had a bigger influence on Henry than the other 3? Or this one. In 1529, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who we were talking about earlier, he was Henry's dearest friend and closest advisor, had failed to get Henry a divorce from his first wife. So initially, Henry had tasked Wolsey with speaking to the Pope and other bishops and setting up a trial. He thought that Wolsey, because he was very powerful, he honestly thought that Wolsey would be able to convince the Pope to grant him a divorce. Wolsey couldn't do that, he failed. Anne Boleyn and Wolsey really didn't get on. Anne Boleyn convinced Henry to execute Wolsey, to get rid of him and to replace him with other people, which Henry does do, and that has a great impact on Henry. Wolsey never actually makes it to the chopping block. He dies of a heart attack before Henry actually manages to get his head off his neck. Do you think that's more important than the others? Or what about this one? After Wolsey was executed, he was replaced by a man called Thomas Cromwell. He was a reformer. If you call someone a reformer, that means that they're always pushing for change. He wanted to see great change in the church. He believed that England should become a Protestant country. Next one. In 1527, it became clear that Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, could no longer have any more children. She had suffered from many miscarriages and given birth to several stillborn babies, but she had given Henry a daughter called Mary. Do you think that factor is more important than the other 6? And last 2. Thomas Cranmer, a close friend of Henry, told him that Henry would gain more power if he set up his own Protestant church in England, and then he would be able to effectively place himself at the top of that church. So Henry, would become the head of the Church of England, and he would no longer have to answer to the Pope. And finally, attitudes towards women during this time were poor. There had never been a Queen of England before, and most people were convinced that a woman would ruin the country if she was put in charge. This put pressure on Henry to have a son before he died. So, loads of information there. As I've said, you do not need to write these out in full. You can shorten them if you want to. You are going to use these 9 factors, and if I just jump back, you are going to write them out in a diamond shape. The most important reason as to why Henry broke with the Roman Catholic Church needs to be written clearly at the top, with the least important reason written at the bottom. So we've got loads of factors going on here. Personal factors, power factors, finance factors, religion, reform, loads of different reasons. But what is your personal opinion? What do you think was the most and least important reason as to why Henry VIII broke with the Roman Catholic Church? So this is going to take you a while, so pause me and get cracking with your diamond 9, please. Okay, I'm hoping that you have got loads of information all organised in a nicely well presented diamond shape, and the final thing, or if you're feeling that your hand is tired from writing so much today, then don't worry about this final bit, but if you want to, try to answer the following question in no less than 50 words. You have to go back and count up all of your words, so I really want you to get as much detail in this as you possibly can. Why do you believe that Henry decided to break with the Roman Catholic Church? You must make sure you explain your point clearly. Now, I've put some keywords in a little box down here that I would like you to try and use, and dates as well. 1533, Reformation, Catherine of Aragon, heir, Anne Boleyn, Catholic, Pope, divorce, Church of England, power, finances, Protestant, Wolsey, Cromwell and Cranmer. Anything that you could think of, try to get some of those keywords within your answer. So you're giving me your personal opinion. I think the main reason Henry VIII decided to break from the Roman Catholic Church was, and then give me a paragraph with no less than 50 words. And then that is me done. Thank you for coming back again and listening to today's lesson. I've been so chuffed going onto my YouTube channel and looking at the amount of numbers that I've been getting in terms of views on all of these videos. We're now sort of at the 100 mark. The first lesson is now over 100 views as well, so I'm super chuffed and I hope you find them useful, and I'm going to keep doing them certainly for the next couple of weeks. Okay, so thanks for coming back and I'll speak to you again later.